Okay, so John telling us the story about Jesus, and last week we read about the feeding of the 5,000, as it's typically called. Matthew actually tells us 5,000 was the number of the men who were there. So if you add women and children, you're looking at, scholars say, potentially up to 20,000 people or so. And yeah, so there are more than 5,000 people. There are 5,000 men. There's at least a little boy there who's got some barley loaves and some fish, and plus, like I said, Matthew says there are women and children as well. So a ton of people. The miracle would have blown your mind if you had been there, and apparently it did blow the minds of those who were there, because it almost resulted in the installation of a new king over Israel. Look at verse 15 of John chapter 6. This was the last verse that we studied through last week. It reads like this in the ESV: "Perceiving then that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." So Jesus performs the miracle. He saved the day, because all these people, these 20,000 people or 10,000, how many it was, they came around the Sea of Galilee, up around the north side probably. They're out here in the wilderness, and, hey, oversight, nobody brought any food. So this is a bad situation. Jesus saves the day, and there's an idea stirring in the minds of the crowd because of this, an idea to take Jesus by force and to make him the nationalistic king of Israel. So before things get to that point, because Jesus' kingdom is not of this world, and Jesus doesn't want to be the nationalistic king of Israel at this point. He's not interested in establishing a theocracy. Jesus removes himself from the situation, leaving even the disciples behind, and heads off to the mountains. Now, you get a little bit of extra information about what's going on here in Matthew and Mark's gospel. A couple of things that I want to point out, mostly just because it's interesting. If you're kind of wondering, like, what happened there that day, Matthew and Mark give us some details. The first thing I would point out is that before Jesus heads up to the mountain by himself, Matthew tells us, and Mark as well, that Jesus gave the disciples a job to do. So he didn't just take off, and the disciples are like, "Hey, where'd Jesus go?" It's actually, John almost makes it sound like that. Matthew says, no, actually, before he took off, he gave the disciples a job to do. This is Matthew 14:22. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. So John doesn't give us that info. He says that Jesus saw the potential messianic fervor stirring up. And you're wondering if Jesus even said anything to the disciples. Well, apparently he did say something to the disciples. He made them get into the boat. The language is really strong in Matthew's gospel. Perhaps there's an urgent sense that he needs to get the disciples moving, because the crowds are going to try to make him king, and he wants to get them going, and he needs to disperse the crowds before anything happens here. So he tells them to get in the boat, makes them get in the boat, head to the other side, back to the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So here's what we got. Sea of Galilee, just to give you some context. In Israel, we're dealing right now with a region called Galilee. It's the northern part of Israel. And here's Nazareth. This is where Jesus grows up. Cana, that's where Jesus does the miracle with turning water into wine. The feeding of the 5,000 is somewhere over here, probably on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. Luke says it's pretty close to Bethsaida, up there in the far northeast. And they take off from there. This is where they're going to head to, Capernaum. The storm actually pushes them a little further south to Gennesaret. But that's where they're going. Across the Sea of Galilee there, makes them get in. Mark says that perhaps they headed up towards Bethsaida first. Mark's gospel is a little confusing on this. We're not quite sure what Mark means, but in both Matthew and Mark, we're given this little bit of info. Jesus actually sends the disciples to the other side of the sea. Okay, The second thing that Matthew and Mark tell us is that Jesus, after he sends them across, Jesus is the one who actually dismisses the crowd. So the crowd wants to make him king. Jesus sends off the disciples. Jesus dismisses the crowd. Matthew 14, 22, and 23. Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. After he had dismissed the crowds, he went up to the mountain by himself to pray. So not only does Jesus send the disciples across, but he dismisses the crowds. It's probably a fairly quick and urgent scene, again, because they want to make him king. He wants to stop that before he gets going. He dismisses everybody. He heads up to the mountain to pray. And I'm thinking I would love to have heard this prayer time between Jesus and his Father. Jesus basically just turns down the opportunity to be king of Israel without having to go through the cross. And who knows what's stirring in his heart as a result of that, but he's like, I need to pray. I need to be by myself, and I need to pray. This is he came as king of Israel. The people want to recognize him as king of Israel. But he knows this is not the kind of kingship, this is not the kind of faith that we're looking for. This is not the kind of kingdom that I'm establishing. So he says no to it. I wonder if it was hard. We don't really know. I'd love to have heard him pray afterwards. That's all we really know, is that he needed to pray. Just some interesting information there from Mark and from Matthew. They both talk about those details. John's account skips all those details. Let's take a look at what John has to say this morning. John 6:16. He's going to set the scene for us. When evening came, after he had fed everybody, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat. Matthew and Mark are saying, because he made them. Got into a boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark. And Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So John sets the next scene, skips those details, doesn't feel like it's necessary for him to give all those details that Matthew and Mark give, because he's not making the same point necessarily. And here's the scene that John sets. After the feeding, the disciples head to the sea. They get into a boat. They start off to Capernaum. Okay? So they're going to go across the sea there to Capernaum. It's 6 to 7 miles. The distance of this crossing. Horsetooth Reservoir right up here is 6.2 miles in length. So if you wonder how far these guys had to row in a storm, think of having to go the long way at Horsetooth, roughly. Okay, they're in the boat. They're in the sea. It's nighttime. They're alone, and Jesus has not yet arrived. And there's a strong wind, as there sometimes can be on the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee sits about 600 feet below sea level, and it's not uncommon for the hot air that's sitting over the sea to rise up as cold air from the tablelands descends down into the sea, rushes down into the sea, and it can actually stir up some really high winds and apparently some extremely violent conditions on the sea. For these guys aren't using modern day fishing boats. They're using old school fishing boats, and that's the scene. And verse 19 tells us that when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Okay, so they're rowing, because in a storm, you're not going to use your sails. Not a storm like this, you're not going to use the sails. They're rowing 6 to 7 miles. And Mark says in Mark 6:48, he says that they were making headway painfully. Okay? This sucks. These guys are really having a hard time getting across. The storm is making things extremely difficult. We've already been told by John that it's dark. In fact, Matthew and Mark tell us that it's extremely late. It's the 4th watch of the night, which means that it's between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. So these guys have been at it for a long time, and We don't know exactly why it took. Did it really take this long to get 3 to 4 miles out? Or did they, like Mark's gospel maybe indicates, did they head up to Bethsaida first, and then were they supposed to meet up with Jesus and then head out? It's hard to know, but it's between 3 and 6 a.m. It's extremely late. They're only 3 to 4 miles from the shore that they left, which means that they are right in the middle of the sea. It's windy, and there are extremely rough seas. They are without Jesus, and then Jesus shows up, and he's walking on the water. He's not walking on a submerged sandbar. Jesus didn't slip the disciples some LSD in their filet of fish sandwich on the shore. Okay, it's not a hallucination that's taking place here. This is not a creative literary device that John has invented as though he's saying Jesus walked on the water, figuratively speaking. Jesus is exercising right here divine power in an extraordinary act that defies the laws of physics. He's walking, literally strolling upon the waves of the sea in the midst of a storm. So what is this? What's the purpose of this remarkable feat? What are the disciples and what are we supposed to learn about Jesus from this? And I think probably our best hint at what's going on here is to look at Old Testament background, because there are a few places in the Old Testament that lend some insight, some places that talk about God's relationship to the sea, God's relationship to the deep, as it's sometimes called in the Old Testament. Think, for example, of the way that God related to the sea in Israel's exodus from Egypt. Psalm 77 is reflecting on the exodus. And specifically, at one portion in Psalm 77, the psalmist is reflecting on God's relationship to the sea through which the Israelites walked. And it says this in Psalm 77, verse 16, "When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. Indeed, the deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies gave forth thunder. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lighted up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea. Your path through the great waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." Okay, so we've got the psalmist reflecting on the Exodus and specifically the crossing of the Red Sea. And we're learning here that God is sovereign over the powerful, deadly, unsearchable, mysterious, chaotic, and dark sea. And when the waters see God, it's the waters who are afraid. We ought to fear the ocean. We ought to fear the sea. The sea is always viewed sort of negatively in the Old Testament. It's seen as a place of chaos. The Leviathan lives in the sea. It's like some ancient reference to this idea of a sea creature, this dark, mysterious, probably even evil sea creature lives in the sea is bad. The sea is not thought of as a good thing in many ways, and the sea is afraid of God. And that's just a way of saying that God is much greater than the power of the sea. The sea is under his command, and he can walk right through the sea if he wants to, and he can lead people to safety through the sea. So God's footsteps through the sea in the Exodus event might be some of what Jesus intends to bring to our minds as he walks upon the sea, especially if you'll remember, in light of the fact that John has drawn our attention to the fact that the feeding of the 5,000, and therefore this walking on the sea event, which takes place just that very night, it's all happening, John points out in chapter 6, verse 4, it's all happening right before Passover. And Passover is a commemoration of the Exodus event, in which God miraculously feeds his people manna in the wilderness, and God safely leads his people through the middle of the Red Sea. So perhaps we're supposed to take note of the correspondence here between Israel's exodus and what's happening in this scene. The miraculous feeding of God's people coupled with God's sovereign footsteps through the sea suggests, I think, probably Exodus type of imagery in these two scenes put back to back. And I think part of what we're supposed to see here is that Jesus is bringing the fulfillment of what God began with the people of Israel. But here now, what Jesus is doing is so much more tangible, so much more intimate than what God even did with his people in the Exodus. The shadows of the Old Testament are giving way to the reality to which they pointed. The one who feeds the people in the wilderness and the one who walks upon the sea is now among them as a human. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. This man is not another link in the chain of the prophets of God. He's the one who orchestrated and intervened in the holy history of the people of Israel. And now he's bringing that history to its climax. And we're supposed to be seeing that. It's supposed to be apparent to us as he strides upon the seas. It's an amazing feat, full of imagery. In the book of Job, God is described as the one, quote, who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea. God alone tramples the waves of the sea. The God of the Bible is regarded as the one in Israel's history who walks on water. And so yet again, here is Jesus engaged in this godlike act, this time displaying his glory, not to the crowds, but to his disciples alone. And here we are with them in the boat, looking over their shoulders. We get to see the God who fed his people in Israel, the God who went through the midst of the sea, is now manifesting himself in Jesus Christ in an unparalleled display, so much more intimate, so much more personal, so much more tangible. And here he is on the waves, and at first the disciples don't even know it's him. This is really interesting. They see him coming near the boat. They're scared. Verse 19. They saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Terrified, in fact, according to Matthew and Mark, who once again give us some more details. They are terrified at the sight of Jesus, and Matthew and Mark tell us that the dread comes from the belief that they're seeing a ghost. Matthew 14:26, Mark 6:49. And not Jesus' ghost, a random ghost in the middle of the lake, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a storm, walking on the water. I mean, it's like straight out of a horror film. It's really, you would be very, very scared if you saw this. And again, John doesn't dive into those details. He's just giving us the meat and potatoes version. They saw Jesus walking on the water, John says. He's coming near the boat, and they were scared. And perhaps the reason that John keeps the whole story uncluttered is because he wants a few things to hit really hard. Verse 19, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Verse 20, but he said to them, it is I. Do not be afraid. And you gotta just pause right there. We got to chew on that. Because I think this is probably what's really supposed to hit hard. It is I. Do not be afraid. It's a simple statement. It's packed with meaning. The sovereign God of the universe strides upon the sea, comes to these men. They're afraid, and he says, it is I. Do not be afraid. Or more literally translated, I am. Ego eimi. I am. No qualification. I am. Do not be afraid. There are several places in John where Jesus makes some pretty profound I am statements. Right? I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the door of the sheep. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. I am the bread of life. Okay? And there are a few places where Jesus simply says, I am. No qualification. And that's what's happening right here. And that little phrase, I am, is how you would typically say, it is I. It's just me. But it's also the same phrase that's used in a very important Old Testament passage. These disciples would have undoubtedly been familiar with it. Now, this gets a little bit complex, so I want you to hang with me. You're going to have to think hard with me for a minute, okay? If you're ready to think hard, please raise your hand. Thank you. Okay. We're going to go to the book of Exodus. So flip to the book of Exodus. We're going to go to chapter 3. Mark your place. Go to the book of Exodus, chapter 3. Give you some Old Testament background. If you're a Jew in the ancient world, you know this passage. Exodus chapter 3, verse 13 and 14 reads like this. Then Moses said to God, well, let me set the scene up. Moses is at the burning bush. God says to Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt, where you just had to flee several years ago because you were going to be killed, because you killed an Egyptian. I want you to go back. And I want you to rescue the slaves, Israelite slaves. I want you to lead them out, bring them out. And Moses says, verse 13, to God, then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Okay, and there it is. If you're an Israelite, you know this passage. This is the moment in which God reveals his covenant name to his people Israel. And this was a foundational passage, therefore, in the history of Israel, because it was from this somewhat cryptic and unsearchable, unfathomable, impenetrable self-identification. I am who I am. It's from that the Hebrew name Yahweh is derived, linguistically speaking, as far as we can tell. The personal covenant name of God, the Hebrew name of God, Yahweh, seems to be linguistically connected to the Hebrew phrase, I am. And I can't go into that with you because I'd have to put a bunch of Hebrew up here on the screen, and that's not going to help anybody but Jed. But here's the gist of what we're looking at right here. When we're talking about God in terms of I am, we're dealing with the covenant God of Israel. The God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, is I am. You have to make that connection in your mind. If you read the Hebrew, you would make the connection, and the connection becomes explicit in the next verse, in verse 15 of Exodus chapter 3. Let me read verse 14 again. God said to Moses, I am who I am, and he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. Verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord. Now that's the word Yahweh. I'll explain it in a second. The Lord, or Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered through all generations. Tell them, I am sent you, and my name is Yahweh. And in the Hebrew, you would see that they're connected linguistically, or at least there's strong suggestion that they're connected linguistically. Now, the name the Lord in verse 15. Notice it's all in caps. Look at verse 15 and look at the word Lord. Lord. It's all in capital letters. When you see that in your English Bibles, that is the English translation of the word Yahweh. I wish we didn't do that. I think the Holman Christian Standard Bible just says Yahweh. I wish all English Bibles would do that because it would eliminate this confusion. So when you see Lord in all capital letters in your Old Testament, it's a reference to, it's a translation of the word Yahweh, the Hebrew name for God. And I'm not going to go into the details of why we translate it as Lord. There's a long-standing tradition behind it, together with some other complicated translation issues. But just know that I am is in verse 14 and Yahweh is in verse 15. So, if you will excuse me from explaining any further complicated linguistic issues, and there are more that I'm not even going into, I'm going to just share with you, here's the point I'm trying to make. For these men, we can surmise that they not only heard Jesus saying, "It is I," but they heard him declaring an epiphany. They heard Jesus saying, "I am." They heard Jesus claiming to be Yahweh, the God of Israel. In the same way that the religious leaders heard Jesus claiming to be Yahweh in John chapter 8, which we haven't got to yet, but we're going to go look at right now. So turn over to John chapter 8. Book of John, we are looking in chapter 6, just a couple chapters later. In chapter 8, we're going to start reading in verse 56. John 8:56. And here you will get a feel for what Israelites heard when somebody says, "I am," in an unqualified way. Here's what Israelites heard. Look at this, John 8:56. Your father Abraham, Jesus says to the Israelite leaders, the Jewish leaders, your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. Now, Abraham had lived like, how many thousands of years? 4,000 years? 3,000 years? 4,000 years, roughly, before Jesus, 2,000 years before Jesus was alive. 4,000 years from us. And Jesus says, he saw my day and was glad. And these guys say, the Jews said to him, you are not yet 50 years old. And have you seen Abraham? Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, ego eimi. I am. So, here's what they think of Jesus making that claim. They picked up stones to throw at him, and Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Okay. Jesus tells the religious leaders that I am before Abraham. And there's no mistaking what he means, because these guys know Exodus 3 quite well. These guys pick up stones to kill him because they understand that Jesus is claiming to be Yahweh. They think that this is blasphemy, of course. They think that he's claiming to be the God of Israel. So when Jesus rolls up on the Sea of Galilee, walking on the waves, and throws out an unqualified I am statement, there's very little doubt about what he's saying or what's being heard by these men, which means that here on the Sea of Galilee, in the midst of the storm, Christ is providing a profound moment of his own self-disclosure to his disciples. The only one who walks upon the seas is Yahweh, and here comes Jesus walking upon the sea and stating that he is Yahweh. I am. And therefore these guys don't need to be afraid. It's not a ghost, it's God in the flesh. It is I am. Do not be afraid. So, if you were in their shoes at that moment, you probably would not be afraid either. You're rowing. Oh my gosh, we're going to die. Yeah, hey guys, God's here? Yeah, he's walking on the water. So, I'm going to have him get in the boat with us. I think we're good. I think we're safe. That's what they do. Verse 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat. And immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Which is another miracle. Boom, boom. It is I. Do not be afraid. And then fear is gone. Gladness sets in. They very willingly have Jesus come on board, and the struggle is over. They miraculously reach the shore in an instant, and the scene is closed. And other than clearly demonstrating that Jesus is the God of Israel, which is, I think, the main point of this passage, I think there is something else that we should spend a few minutes talking about. Something that really begs for our attention, I think, and it's this command to the disciples that they shouldn't be afraid. Because God's there with them in Jesus. It is I. Do not be afraid. It's easy to understand why these guys were afraid. Right? They're in the middle of a storm. They're in the dark morning hours on the Sea of Galilee, thinking that they're seeing a ghost. If you were there, you would be scared too, I think. And yet, if you belong to Christ, once you realize that Jesus is there with you, you don't have to be afraid, even of the most life-threatening situation. If God is there, you don't have to be afraid. God can handle this. Now, how he's going to handle it, who knows? Yeah, that's his business, but he can handle it. Remember, as we talked about last week, whatever your problem in life may be, is nothing compared to the ultimate dilemma which Jesus has resolved for it. Jesus can handle the dilemma that you're facing in your life right now. And the reason I know that is because Jesus can handle the ultimate dilemma that you have ever or will ever face. Sin has placed us in a situation far worse than the storm on the Sea of Galilee. The wages of sin, the paycheck of sin, the payback of sin, the merit, what you deserve, what you've earned, what you've merited because of sin is death. Romans 6:23, an eternal death that makes the Sea of Galilee look like the kitchen sink. And Jesus steps into the hurricane of the wrath of God, and he rescues us out of it. He delivers us from certain eternal destruction. And if you're trusting in Jesus, then he resolved the ultimate dilemma by means of his death and his resurrection from you. And that removes all fear of eternal judgment, all fear of what will happen when you stand before God on the last day. We sang about it this morning. Now, why this fear and unbelief? Has not the Father put to grief his Son for us? You don't have to be afraid when you face the Father on the day of judgment. And if you don't know that relief from the fear of the wrath of God, I would just invite you, plead with you, implore you, beg you, please be reconciled to God. He has taken the wrath of his anger. It's been poured out on his Son. But when you trust in Jesus, the record of your sin and your guilt, it gets placed on Jesus. And his record of perfect righteousness gets placed on you. And therefore, when you stand in the courtroom of God, Jesus gets one verdict: guilty. And he's punished for it at Calvary. That's what happened at Calvary. And you know what your verdict is? Not guilty. Because you're clothed in the robe of the righteousness of Jesus. That can be yours. And that means that on the day of judgment, no fear. Your eternity is secure. You're good. And if God can resolve that dilemma, then the sea is no problem for him. If he resolved that, whatever you might be facing today or next year, it's under control. The sea is not a problem for Jesus. He plants his footsteps in the sea. He rides upon the storm. Your financial situation is not a problem for Jesus. Your job situation is not a problem for Jesus. Your health, it's not a problem for Jesus. Whatever it is that you're afraid of, it's not a problem for Jesus. Death is not a problem for Jesus. And if you belong to him, then you don't have to be afraid. Because he not only set things right between you and God, but he's got this situation under control as well. Whatever it is that you're facing, He rules over the waters. He knows exactly what he's doing by placing you where he has placed you. Now, very important to realize this. In this situation, these men, Jesus resolves the threatening circumstances. Okay, these guys make it to shore. They're very glad that they did, I'm sure. And we might be tempted to think, okay, if Jesus can solve the problem of my sin and death, which is ultimately, I think, what his rescue of these disciples is pointing towards. They're in a situation of almost certain death. Jesus can walk on the waters, rescue them from the storm, bring them safely to the haven of protection. If Jesus can save you from the eternal death that this whole scene is pointing to, then Jesus doesn't have a problem with the situation that you're in right now. We have to be careful that we don't say, hey, look, if Jesus is with you, then God's going to help you get out of bad situations. Because that's what he did for these guys. Okay? Don't make the mistake of thinking that this passage is teaching us that God, if he's with you, will get you out of bad situations. That's what happened in this case, but that's not what always happens. Even if God is with you. The reason these guys can take courage is because God is with them. Regardless of the outcome, there are times when Jesus does not fix the circumstances. We all know this. There are times when he doesn't fix the circumstances. All the disciples who were rescued from this storm, every one of them died eventually. 10 of them as martyrs, according to church tradition, which means they suffered to their last breath. But you know what's amazing? Is that when that time came, those guys weren't afraid to die. They didn't think that just because Jesus was with them, he was going to get them out of the martyrdom situation. They knew that they could face even martyrdom, and they would be okay, as long as the Lord is with them. So I think that as we look over the shoulders of the disciples on the boat in the midst of the waters, we too see with them that Jesus is in fact the God of Israel. And in light of that, if you're his disciple, we are commanded together with them, do not fear. Yahweh is with us in Christ, and Christ is with us even right now through the presence of the Holy Spirit. Christ is with us. And if you're trusting in Jesus, then the ultimate dilemma has been resolved, and your circumstances are under control. They will soon prove to be part of a larger, epic narrative that ends in absolute glory with you and the Father dwelling together for eternity. And we're not questioning the outcome of the story. We don't have to be afraid, which is awesome because human beings, I think, are deeply fearful creatures. We really are. You don't have to be in the middle of the Sea of Galilee to be afraid. Okay? You might be living in fear this morning. That's what anxiety is. It's fear. If you stay up at night, like me, at times, because you can't shake thoughts from your mind, or you walk in here today with a heart that's all twisted up and worried because of some situation you're fretfully trying to figure out how to navigate, some challenging situation, and your heart is anxiously mulling over some problem you can't control, then you're afraid. Worry is fear. Anxiety is fear. And this morning, Christ has a word for you. I am. Do not be afraid. Just chew on that. That's what he would say to us. That command, in its various different forms, do not be afraid, do not fear, fear not, take courage, take heart. It's said to be the most often repeated command in the Bible. I cannot confirm that. I tried to look for somebody reliable yesterday on the internet. I couldn't find anybody who said that. I wasn't going to count all the numbers of all the different commands in the Bible. So I don't know if it's true that it's the most often repeated command in the Bible, but certainly there is no doubt of its incredible frequency. Do not fear, do not fear, do not fear, do not fear, do not be afraid. Man, we live in so much fear. I am with you. Stop being afraid. Genesis 26:24. I am the God of Abraham, your father. Fear not, for I am with you. Joshua 1:9. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Fear not, Isaiah 41:10. Fear not. I love this one. Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. It doesn't mean circumstances will turn out painless or that everything will go as you prefer. It might. It might not. Probably won't. At least that's my own story. Probably won't go as you prefer. And if it doesn't go as you prefer, fear not. Because even in that, Christ will be with you. He reigns over the sea. He reigns over sin and death. He reigns over your life and every single little circumstance. And in time, he will bring us to our appointed destination with the Father, and it will be unspeakably magnificent. And so, know that Jesus is with you, Choice City, and do not be afraid. Amen.